There are games with fun movement and momentum, and games with fun combat that also have fun momentum. But Code Bunny stands out as a game where momentum is your primary form of combat. Whether it's Hazel and her ability to split-second dash to a foe, or Axel, who bounces off his opponents to chip away at their health, literally building damage by building that particular spinning momentum of his. Both characters do have a standard mashy multi-hit combo you can perform at a standstill, but the game heavily dissuades you from relying on it, when the alternative option to bunny hop and play pinball to beat up baddies is so much more creative and exhilarating. Hazel throws arrows to mark enemies from a distance to perform her Ghost Crescent move, instantly unsheathing her sword at any current sigil, regardless of distance or physical obstacles. But it doesn't just stop at a safe teleport to that location, as homing onto a foe carries the momentum it takes to get her there. So you have some interesting ways to branch out with that momentum. You can either thrust downward at your foe and use them as a bouncy platform, evade with that momentum, as pulling off a Ghost Crescent grants you a double jump and a burst of speed away from your opponent, or my personal favorite option, teleporting to a foe and daring to keep Hazel around their hitbox, waiting for a frame-perfect spark of contact to perform a mid-air parry that not only slashes through an opponent, but also leaves a sigil on them, allowing for easy access to another Ghost Crescent opportunity. Piece together that recursive formula, and you got a super fun way to constantly tug at your opponent. A lot more interesting than your typical game with a homing attack, guaranteed to get you through a pre-planned chain of obstacles. Here you tangle with the adrenaline rush that comes from a homing attack, either advancing beyond a chain or fully embracing danger headfirst to reap some sweet follow-ups. But yeah, okay, whatever. You can be a cool wandering samurai who conveniently tricksters to a goon. How about if you're just a good little figure skater in an action game, huh? Axel, in contrast, has no homing properties, making his momentum-based attacks more manual to master, which can honestly be pretty intimidating at first, with how easy you can misfire a spin, or get discouraged by how his spinning move gets him pushed back when coming into contact with a front-facing foe. But let's not lie to ourselves and assume that good momentum in a video game means always keeping the screen scrolling, because even when Axel gets reflected back, he stays in a spin and earns some energy to his meter, enough to keep him hurtling onto that opponent till their destruction. Building meter allows him to pull off trickier extensions of his spinning state, namely an upward, downward, and forward boost, and defeating an enemy at their last bit of health with either the forward or upward boost grants you a full refill of this meter. Otherwise, keeping Axel inactive while full on meter will instead grant him a forgiving shield that phases through any attack, but also depletes your meter. It's a very forgiving system, making it such that Axel's health bar is practically window dressing than some crucial factor to the gameplay. But it is one that succeeds in prioritizing a higher skill ceiling, encouraging you to stay vigilant with attacking foes and maintaining meter to optimally stay on the speedy offensive, seldom needing to passively accept a free hit for slower gameplay. This is the kinda combat platformer where from two unique angles you can spend a majority of your playtime constantly being in motion, ghosting or spinning. Though I'll be real, this is where I think the game and I have some conflicting priorities in regards to how that constant momentum should be treated. Whereas I love to just scout every enemy I can and toy around with the combat optimally, Code Bunny overall is a linear speedrunning platforming game, about getting to the goal as fast as possible. Enemies here are less intended to be gatekeepers that have to be eliminated efficiently, but more like pawns meant to be manipulated and swiftly abandoned in favor of the bursts of fast-forward airtime that merely targeting them provides. It is unique to use melee combat as platforming options, especially in the way Code Bunny does it. But it is kinda unfortunate for me that the game doesn't really want you to focus on using that momentum for pure fighting. It wants you to use the combat for speedy course clearing. which, to be fair, does have some considerate design in the levels for a fun time attack time, with how enemies feel deliberately arranged to form reaction chains that you can go through with zero interruptions, and also how these linear levels are vertically tiered, often putting the threat of pits below your current path that will take you to a more inconvenient or slower lane. So diligence to maintain your character and their combat chains at a higher and more efficient tier is key to an optimal run. I can see what they're going for, a combat platformer where combat serves the platforming, but ultimately I just would have liked a game with combat so finely tuned for fast DPS like this that lets you dig into the actual combat more. Maybe trap you into arenas to clear out waves of enemies as fast as possible, or beefier enemy variants or even mini-bosses mid-stage that put a constraint to the momentum of your run, unless you deal with taking them out efficiently to proceed. Axel and Hazel have fun tools to keep them advancing forward, but levels don't really get to make much use of the additional buffs to their meter-based moves. Axel has a special dive kick he can perform that does pretty great damage, but what good is unleashing it when there's no one to really show it to? And you may have noticed I haven't even brought up Hazel's meter properties, and that's because they hardly factor that much into the levels either. Hazel's combos are labeled as karma, and once a combo ends, that number gets filled into her karma meter, making her Ghost Crescent stronger, but with the consequence that she can now take more damage to her health than normal. And getting this meter maxed puts her in a mode that grants her the strongest attacks, but always at the risk of a one-hit defeat. And on one hand, I do think one side of this mechanic works with the linear course clearing of the levels, as it encourages you to keep a combo from start to end. Otherwise, you risk having this meter filled and putting Hazel in more danger before making it to the goal. It makes for a decent risk that can indirectly creep up on you in the midst of rewarding yourself with Hazel's satisfying homing and parrying combat. But otherwise, the damage aspects of this mechanic, like with Axel, don't really mean that much when there's hardly any truly formidable enemies, nor any real reason to engage against enemies in experimental combo play when the focus is on literally fleeting with the combat. The game's ranking system tries to find a good middle ground by scoring your performance based on how high of a combo you were able to maintain and how fast you were able to beat the level. And it can be kinda interesting to figure out how many hits you gotta land on opponents without taking out everyone you see on screen while also keeping your forward momentum going. But really, this boils the game down to combo as much as you can, but don't get too comfy with combo play, lest you want to waste your time and miss the deadline side of this ranking. It's a ranking system that tries to combine both time attack and score attack, and it just doesn't really work for me personally. I just like having one or the other. Generally speaking, when I think of combat-oriented games, I don't really think about rushing or even skipping fights. I think of scheming with all the tools that I have to thoroughly, or even stylishly, clear out my adversaries. Even in momentum-based and speedrunning games like this, I've had a history of giving the hot take that I don't care too much for speedrunning or time attacking them either. I just like science, and I like how science-y these kind of games are, and I like getting lost in their sciences. I like toying with what works and doesn't work about mechanics and systems, without much pressure on whether I'm optimizing everything to their nth degree. So let it be known that most of my problems with Code Bunny are centered on its speedrunning focus that just didn't really click with me personally, where I think not enough focus is placed on learning to love and get lost in its combat, and where even the speedrunning angle feels a bit underwhelming with how abrupt and brief these levels end up being anyways. Look at this level, it's set up as this hard-boiled operation to search for a mysterious fugitive in a luminous forest, and you take a few steps and there she is. Then you fall into her trap and gotta chase after her. And oh look, we found her after like a minute of level. But let it also be known that I am pretty forgiving to all of this, because time attack and ranking be damned, I just like messing around with every enemy I see and getting lost in this game's momentum-based combat anyways. I enjoy seeing how long I can bunny hop on an opponent, even if there's not much of a valid, goal-oriented reason to do so. I do wish more of the game was based around it, but in the end, that's just how satisfying Code Bunny can feel, even if you're not playing it by its pro-intended design. Big reason I bring all this up though, is that my favorite part of the game by a long shot are its boss fights. With a tankier foe and a strict arena to stay confined to, you now have a good reason to experiment and learn to love the combat, and actually engage with Axel's and even Hazel's strength advantages from their meter management. Playing pinball enough to land a sweet crushing dive kick on your foe, or building enough chains, then waiting it out to fill Hazel's karma meter, to land more sinister blows with the risk of getting taken out at any point of that waiting phase. Just look at my footage here. I am having a blast just immersing myself in how this combat ebbs and flows. That's what's so refreshing about the combat of Code Bunny. There's not really a flow chart to combo true, there's just pure flow, darting and improvising with your character while on the offensive. Like any game with a good eye for momentum, I can respect the focus on time attack, but this is an art of fighting that's pretty dang special, and I really can't get anywhere else. Code Bunny may use its momentum tricks for pretty standard linear platformer affairs, and you'll definitely get your guaranteed jollies from that guaranteed art of platforming. But how I think it interprets fighting with momentum is something that I think deserves to be cherished a lot more, and not only just in sheer combat gameplay, but also in the way that it tells its story, finding some interesting ways to weave in the art of momentum combat into the background of the characters that you play as. Bit of a spoiler talk right now, so feel free to bunny hop around this section if you prefer. For example, Hazel's swordplay derives from the sword of her previous battle partner and good friend that she admired during her time enlisting as an army soldier, whom had gone berserk during an operation, and where Hazel was forced to use his sword to apprehend him out of desperation. That tragic moment solidifying the way she was bound to act as a combat soldier from that point forward, targeting and instantly reaching her opponents with no hesitation. A moment of weakness turned into a curse of her fighting style, and thus the core of her gameplay. It's neat to have a character's gift of movement and momentum being tied to a negative experience, rather than just being some natural skilled prowess of her character. That being said, between the two character campaigns, I'd say Hazel's story was the one where I felt like I was going through the motions with the most. Code Bunny's world building in general feels very played out for tragedy and drama. It's a world fueled by some special solitary energy type, so you have the space and military programs that want to govern that energy, while secretly abusing it for nefarious and megalomaniacal purposes, and the rogues in the outskirts who are viewed as evil, but inherently want to protect it for the good of all individuals. Hazel's a cold-blooded soldier on one side who eventually warms up and insubordinates the program she previously pledged to, and it all feels very clockwork. I do feel for the idea that she only joined the army through being inspired by the goodwill of her good friend, and having them gone means you're stuck in a rut, trying to live up to this legacy, while being burdened to be at this faction you really don't agree with. How do you avenge what they stood for when you're regulated to stand for the cause you enlisted to? Which is why she takes everything initially with such serious cynicism. But it might just be the rapid-fire pacing of this game's campaign for me that makes her transition from only caring about the mission and the results to, hey stop, I actually didn't mean how I acted those first few levels ago, not terribly convincing to me. If anything, I kinda wish there were more scenes between Hazel and Axel, as getting exposed to Axel is what helps Hazel lighten up and realize the personal side of enlisting into a soldier suit that I think could have been built up more into a really sweet friendship, and not just one novelty of a cutscene. Which brings me to my next talking point of the plot, which is that I actually found myself really invested in Axel's side of the campaign, and the origins of his momentum combat. Axel originally wanted to become a figure skater, while his brother wanted them to explore outer space. So to honor his brother's dying wish in the present, he splits the difference by enlisting as an army soldier who fights with a unique figure skating style. which to others, and especially in the eyes of someone more trained and scorned in regulatory combat like Hazel, can come across as very childish and foolish. But something about how Axel describes how your hobbies and passions end up being ingrained into who you are as a person, even if you end up somewhere professionally in life that is almost completely incompatible with that hobby or passion, really stuck with me personally. Making room for passion and profession is difficult, and I really appreciated how far Axel's story explored that gray area. With this greater conflict of abusing the power of the universe between opposing factions and righteous individuals, it makes his decisions to where he stands in the plot all the more endearing, seeing how they're coming from this really innocent but fundamental point of view, caring more about who people are from their humble origins, and not on what they are obligated to enlist in without their free will. My favorite trope of Axel's story is how he always works on this gut feeling that he can't explain, something that he's probably too young or naive to put into words, but just knows that every person involved in this massive conspiracy plot is someone who once had a dream or loved one and got to this position in life because of, or in spite of the loss, of that unspoken thing they care about. It's a really sweet angle to this otherwise very dramatic plot, and a really sweet way to articulate why the combat of this game is based uniquely on momentum, a property that's usually taken for granted as a recess activity rather than a trained tactic. Ice skating just reminds him of who he is in that he had some fresh perspective in a pretty played out war scenario, which makes his choices to stop fighting or to at least subdue his opponents and help them see past the tragedy of this energy crisis a pretty well-earned and mature moment, and a real nice way to end the story. The energy of this world is revealed to not only be a fuel source, but an inherent source of life that flows within all beings, with even the potential to carry the data of those who've passed away. The CEO of the military space program Hazel and Axel enlist to harnesses this power not necessarily to rule the world, but to reveal the truth of this world to the masses. That life is essentially a dream that is fatal and prone to loss. Hazel, of course, follows the will of the ones that inspired her to look past that, but I think Axel really earns the flagpole at the end of this cyber apocalypse. He's always been someone to look past image and roles, and even with the world at its limit and being basically revealed as an image of a lie, he ultimately shrugs that off and says, well, life is a lie, but it is still life, even if it is a dream. You'll meet an end, but that's all the more reason to find and keep hoping for new paths and possibilities to come your way. Make up your own truths in spite of the lie. And I think that is just the ultimate theme to land on when it comes to a piece of media focusing on the concept of momentum, that it could make for fun and replayable gameplay systems despite some flaws or shortcomings that will make you cherish them for the sport they are. But they're also the perfect gateway to tell a tale about moving forward against the odds. It's novel to have an action game about bouncing off your enemies, and it's poignant to end said game by bouncing your way out of the hypothetical end of the world.